What if I told you that the most Catholic nation in Asia, a country where churches outnumber mosques 1,000 to 1 and where Christmas celebrations begin in September, was never meant to exist at all? Spain did not set out to colonize the Philippines. It was searching for spices, for a shortcut to the Moluccas, for wealth that would make a king's treasury overflow. Instead, it stumbled into something far more consequential: 333 years of dominion over 7,000 islands and the millions of people who called them home. Today, more than 100 million Filipinos carry surnames like Santos, Cruz, and Reyes, pray in Spanish-built churches that have stood for 4 centuries, and celebrate a faith imposed by conquistadors who arrived with swords in one hand and crucifixes in the other. How did a small fleet of Spanish ships, sailing from Mexico across an ocean no European had ever crossed eastward, transform a fragmented world of island kingdoms into a unified colonial territory that would reshape Asia forever? Join us as we uncover the full story of one of history's most consequential, most brutal, and most misunderstood colonial enterprises. Long before the first Spanish sail appeared on the horizon, long before the cross was planted in unfamiliar soil, the islands that would one day bear the name of a Spanish king were already alive with civilization. The Philippine archipelago, 7,100 islands scattered like stepping stones across the western Pacific, was home to hundreds of independent communities known as barangays. Each barangay, typically numbering between 30 and 100 households, functioned as its own sovereign world. At its head stood the Dadu, a chieftain whose authority rested not on hereditary divine right alone, but on personal valor, accumulated wealth, and the loyalty of those who followed him. These were not primitive villages scratching at the earth. They were sophisticated political units, bound by codes of law, systems of debt and obligation, and intricate social hierarchies that distinguished the free, the indebted, and the enslaved. What held these scattered communities together was trade. For centuries before any European cartographer had correctly sketched the coastline of Southeast Asia, Filipino merchants were already fluent participants in one of the most dynamic commercial networks the ancient world had ever produced. Chinese traders arrived with porcelain, silk, and iron, and they left with beeswax, gold, and forest goods. Arab and Indian merchants carried their own cargo of textiles and spices through the same waters. The island of Luzon maintained direct trading relationships with China dating back to at least the 10th century, and archaeological digs have unearthed Chinese ceramics and burial sites across the archipelago, silent testimony to centuries of exchange. Along with trade goods came ideas. Islam arrived in the southern islands of Mindanao during the 14th century, carried by Muslim missionaries and merchants moving northward through the Malay world. By the early 15th century, the Sultanate of Sulu had emerged as a formidable regional power, its authority stretching across sea lanes and island communities alike. By the time a Spanish fleet would arrive in 1521, Islam had traveled as far north as Manila Bay itself, where a Muslim community led by the Raja Suleiman held sway over the mouth of the Pasig River. Yet the majority of the archipelago still practiced indigenous beliefs, honoring spirits called Anito, maintaining oral traditions of epic poetry, and recording their world in Baybayin, a flowing script of 17 characters derived from the ancient Brahmic writing systems of South Asia. This was not a people without history, without culture, without their own sense of order and beauty. This was a world balanced on its own terms, connected to a vast Asian civilization stretching from the Chinese coast to the Arabian Sea. It was a world on the edge of transformation, though none of its inhabitants could yet know what force would soon arrive from the opposite direction entirely, sailing west to reach the east. While the peoples of the Philippine archipelago traded and governed by ancient custom, a revolution was unfolding on the other side of the world. In the courts of Lisbon and Seville, two rival kingdoms had developed an appetite for something far grander than regional power. They wanted the world itself, and they were prepared to divide it. The catalyst was Portuguese. For most of the 1400s, Portugal had been methodically pushing southward along the African coast, searching for a sea route to Asia that bypassed the Muslim merchants who controlled the overland spice trade. When Vasco da Gama finally reached India in 1498, he confirmed what had long been suspected. Whoever controlled the maritime routes to Asia controlled the most lucrative commerce on Earth. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon were worth more than their weight in silver in European markets, and they all originated from a cluster of islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago known as the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands. Spain, watching Portugal's eastern triumphs with mounting anxiety, had placed its own bet in the opposite direction. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west under the Spanish flag, expecting to reach Asia and instead colliding with a continent nobody in Europe had expected to find. The resulting territorial scramble between the two Catholic powers grew so fierce that Pope Alexander VI intervened, and in 1494 the Treaty of Tordesillas drew an imaginary line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal. Everything to the west belonged to Spain. It was a breathtaking act of papal cartography, dividing a world that neither power fully understood yet. But as Portugal consolidated its hold over Brazil, the Indian Ocean, and eventually the Malay port of Malacca in 1511, a critical question remained unanswered. Where exactly did that dividing line fall on the other side of the globe? And did the Spice Islands fall within Spain's hemisphere or Portugal's? This was not merely an academic dispute. It was a question worth fortunes, fleets, and lives. Spain's conquest of the Americas had proven enormously profitable, but Spanish merchants and strategists understood that American silver alone was not enough. Asia, with its silks and spices, represented a different order of wealth entirely. By 1519, the ambition crystallizing in the Spanish court had found its instrument. A Portuguese navigator named Fernão de Magalhães, known to history as Ferdinand Magellan, had fallen out of favor in Lisbon and taken his expertise to the Spanish crown instead. He proposed something audacious. Rather than sailing east like the Portuguese, he would sail west, find a passage through or around the Americas, and cross an unknown ocean beyond to reach the Spice Islands and prove they fell within Spain's rightful domain. King Charles I of Spain agreed. The fleet that would change the Philippines forever was being assembled. On the morning of September the 20th, 1519, 5 ships and approximately 270 men slipped out of the Spanish port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda and pointed their bows toward the unknown. Magellan's fleet, the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago, carried cannons, trade goods, and an ambition that no European expedition had yet dared to test. The open Atlantic swallowed them whole. The voyage nearly broke apart before it began. Storms battered the fleet along the South American coast. A mutiny among the Spanish captains, who resented their Portuguese commander, had to be crushed by force. One ship wrecked entirely. But Magellan pressed on, and in October 1520, he threaded his way through the treacherous, fog-bound strait at the southern tip of South America that now bears his name. Beyond it lay what he called the Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. It was a cruel name. The crossing took nearly 4 months, and the men survived on rats, sawdust, and leather scraped from the ship's rigging. When the fleet finally touched land in the Visayan Islands in March 1521, the men who stumbled ashore were skeletal, scurvy-ravaged, and desperate. They had arrived at a place no European had ever intentionally sought. The air smelled of wood smoke and the sea, and the people who watched them from the shore had no framework to understand what they were witnessing. But contact was made, and it moved with surprising speed towards something resembling alliance. Magellan encountered Raja Humabon, the ruler of Cebu, and recognized immediately that the Visayas were not a simple, unified world. The islands were a mosaic of competing chieftains and old rivalries. Magellan saw both an opportunity and a mission. Within weeks of arrival, he had overseen a remarkable ceremony. Humabon, his queen, who received the Christian name Juana, and reportedly more than 800 of their subjects accepted baptism into the Catholic faith. It was the first mass conversion in Philippine history, and Magellan pressed a carved wooden image of the Santo Niño, the Holy Child, into Juana's hands as a token of the new bond between her people and the Spanish crown. Was it genuine faith or shrewd diplomacy? Almost certainly both, woven together in the complex way that power has always worked. Humabon recognized in the Spanish fleet a potential weapon against his local rivals. Magellan, for his part, saw in Humabon's allegiance proof that the Philippines could be folded into Spain's expanding world. That conviction would kill him. When a neighboring chieftain on the island of Mactan, a man named Lapu-Lapu, refused to submit to Humabon's authority or acknowledge the Spanish, Magellan took it as a personal challenge. On the 27th of April, 1521, he led a force of roughly 60 armored Europeans across the shallows toward Mactan's shore. He had refused to wait for full tide, reportedly out of pride. The Spanish ships could not get close enough to provide covering fire. What followed was less a battle than a catastrophe. Lapu-Lapu's warriors, numbering in the hundreds, met the Spaniards in the surf with spears, arrows, and intimate knowledge of their own ground. Magellan's armor protected his body, but not his legs, and when a bamboo spear found its mark, he fell. His men retreated in disorder. The great navigator who had conceived one of history's boldest voyages died face down in a Philippine bay, just short of his moment of triumph. The survivors, now fewer and more frightened, abandoned one of their remaining ships for lack of crew and eventually limped westward toward home. On September the 6th, 1522, the Victoria, a single battered vessel carrying 18 survivors, arrived back in Spain. They had circled the Earth for the first time in recorded history. It was a staggering achievement. But the islands they had touched remained unconquered, their potential unrealized, their fate still unwritten. Spain would need to send another expedition and then another. The Victoria's return had proven something extraordinary. The Philippines were reachable. But reaching them and holding them were entirely different problems. Spain's next attempt came quickly. In 1525, Garcia Jofre de Loisa led 7 ships westward along Magellan's route. The expedition was plagued almost from the start. Ships were scattered by storms. Loisa himself died at sea. His second in command died shortly after. By the time the shattered remnants of the fleet reached the Spice Islands, they were in no condition to press onward to the Philippines. The men who survived were absorbed into conflicts with the Portuguese, who regarded this entire ocean as their domain. The expedition vanished into the vast Pacific without leaving Spain any closer to its goal. Álvaro de Saavedra tried a different approach in 1527, sailing eastward from Mexico rather than westward from Spain. He reached the Philippine archipelago and briefly touched its northern islands, but he faced a problem that would haunt every subsequent expedition. Nobody had yet solved the tournaviage, the return voyage home across the Pacific. The trade winds that push ships westward so reliably seemed to offer no mirror route heading east. Saavedra attempted the crossing twice. Both times the winds defeated him, pushing his ships back toward Asia. He died at sea during the second attempt. His men returned the only way available, westward to Portuguese territory, where they were promptly imprisoned. For 15 years, Spain sent no further expeditions. The cost was enormous, the losses staggering, and the Pacific seemed determined to keep its secrets. But the ambition never fully cooled. Ruy López de Villalobos sailed in 1542, commanding a fleet from New Spain with instructions to establish a permanent settlement. He reached the islands and did something that would echo through history. Looking at the archipelago spreading before him, he named it Las Islas Filipinas, the Philippine Islands, in honor of Prince Philip, heir to the Spanish throne and the man who would become Philip II. It was a claim staked in language, if not yet in stone. But Villalobos, like those before him, could not solve the Tornavia. His settlement attempts collapsed under food shortages and local resistance. He too was forced westward into Portuguese custody, where he died in 1544, never returning to Spain. What these 4 failed expeditions had purchased, at tremendous human cost, was knowledge. Sailors and soldiers had mapped coastlines, studied currents, cataloged the peoples and politics of the archipelago, and identified where settlements might one day take root. Each failure taught Spain something the next captain could carry forward. The Pacific was not unconquerable. It simply required the right approach, the right season, and the right man. By the late 1550s, Spanish ambitions burned as fiercely as ever, and the crown had begun searching for exactly that combination, setting the stage for one final decisive expedition. The man Spain chose was Miguel López de Legazpi, a seasoned administrator from the Basque Country who had spent years governing Mexico City with quiet competence. He was not a young adventurer chasing glory. He was methodical, patient, and precise. Paired with him was an Augustinian friar named Andrés de Urdaneta, a navigator of rare genius who had sailed these waters decades earlier with Loisa and had spent the intervening years studying the Pacific secrets. Together, they represented something Spain had never quite managed before: experience married to preparation. On the 21st of November, 1564, Legazpi's fleet of 4 ships and roughly 370 men departed the port of Navidad on Mexico's western coast. The destination was the Philippines. The mission was permanent settlement, not exploration, not trade contact, but the planting of a Spanish colony that would endure. They reached the island of Cebu in April of 1565. The reception was not warm. The local community, wary of outsiders after decades of contact with various foreign vessels, initially resisted. Legazpi responded with a combination of force and restraint that would define the early Spanish approach. He was willing to fight, but he preferred negotiation. It was a strategy born less from idealism than from arithmetic. He had 300 men in a vast archipelago of millions. Before consolidating his position in Cebu, Legazpi made a detour to the neighboring island of Bohol that would pass into legend. There, he met Datu Sikatuna, a local chieftain of significant influence. On the 7th of March, 1565, the two men performed the Sandugo, the blood compact. Each man drew blood and mixed it into a cup of wine, then drank. It was a sacred ritual of alliance in Philippine culture, carrying the weight of brotherhood and mutual obligation. Legazpi understood its significance and honored it. The compact with Sikatuna secured a crucial ally and demonstrated that not all of the archipelago's peoples would be conquered by force. Some would be brought in through ceremony through respect for existing custom. Back in Cebu, Legazpi established the first permanent Spanish settlement in the Philippines. His men discovered among the ruins of a local dwelling something remarkable, a statue of the Santo Niño, the infant Jesus, believed to be a gift originally brought by Magellan 44 years earlier. For the Spanish, it felt like providence, a sign that God had preserved his presence in these islands, waiting for their return. But the colony's survival depended on something beyond divine signs. It depended on supply lines. And supply lines required the Tornavia, the still unsolved problem of sailing east across the Pacific back to New Spain. Urdaneta, the old navigator who had pondered this question for decades, finally solved it. He sailed north first, far north into the higher latitudes above the trade winds, until he found the westerly currents that swept vessels eastward across the ocean. In October of 1565, his ship arrived in Acapulco after 130 days at sea. The route was open. The Manila Galleon trade, which would eventually connect Asia and the Americas for 250 years, had its foundation. Legazpi used the remaining years of the decade to consolidate. He negotiated where he could, fought where he had to, and built the institutional framework of a colonial government. Resistance came steadily from Cebuano communities unhappy with Spanish demands for food and labor, from raiders who tested the settlement's defenses, from the simple reality that a few hundred soldiers were attempting to govern by force of will what force of arms alone could not hold. By 1569, the foothold was real but fragile. Spain had what the previous 4 expeditions could never achieve, a colony that had survived its first years. The question now was whether it could grow, whether it could extend its reach northward toward the large island the Spanish called Luzon, where a far greater prize awaited. A city would need to be built, and empires are made in cities. The prize Legazpi had been building toward lay at the northern end of the archipelago on the great island of Luzon. There, at the mouth of the Pasig River where it emptied into a wide, sheltered bay, sat a thriving Muslim settlement called Manila. Governed by 2 rulers, Raja Solomon and the elder Raja Lakandula, it was a prosperous trading port with connections stretching across maritime Southeast Asia. It had cannons. It had fortifications, and it had no intention of surrendering. Legazpi dispatched his grandson, Juan de Salcedo, and his field commander, Martin de Goiti, northward in 1570 to assess the situation. The initial encounter was tense. Goiti's force clashed with Solomon's warriors, and Manila's defenses were put to the test. The settlement resisted but could not hold. Solomon ordered the city burned rather than handed intact to the Spanish, a defiant gesture that reduced much of Manila to ash and embers. It was the act of a man who understood what was coming and refused to make it easy. Legazpi himself arrived the following year. On the 24th of June, 1571, amid the ruins Solomon had left behind, He formally established the city of Manila as the capital of the Spanish Philippines. Both Soliman and Lacandula eventually submitted, accepting Spanish authority under terms that preserved some of their status and landholdings. Whether this was pragmatism or resignation, history does not say clearly. But the deed was done. Spain had its capital. What Legazpi built on that ground was not merely an administrative center. It was a fortress city designed to project permanence into an uncertain world. The construction of intramuros, meaning within the walls, began almost immediately. Its massive stone ramparts, eventually stretching over 2 kilometers, enclosed a grid of Spanish streets, churches, government buildings, and residences. The walls were not decorative. They were a statement. This city was not going anywhere. Manila's geography made it something extraordinary. Positioned at the junction of the Pacific and the Asian mainland, it sat equidistant from China, Japan, the Spice Islands, and the coasts of New Spain. The bay was deep enough for large vessels. The river provided fresh water and inland access. Within a decade of its founding, merchants from China, known to the Spanish as Sangley traders, were arriving in significant numbers, bringing silk, porcelain, and goods that the Spanish could never produce themselves. Manila became the hinge point of a trading system that would define global commerce for generations. The implications were staggering. Silver mined by indigenous laborers in the mountains of Peru and Mexico flowed west across the Pacific through Acapulco, arriving in Manila to be exchanged for Chinese luxury goods that then made their way back east. Manila stood at the center of this circuit, growing wealthy on the difference. It was among the earliest examples of truly global trade, and it ran through a city that had not existed a decade before. While Manila took shape, Spanish authority spread outward across Luzon and back through the Visayas. Juan de Salcedo conducted a series of expeditions through northern Luzon between 1570 and 1576, negotiating alliances with some communities and subduing others by force. The Augustinian friars moved alongside the soldiers, establishing missions, learning local languages, and beginning the long process of religious conversion that would prove more durable than any military campaign. Legazpi himself did not live to see this expansion complete. He died in Manila on the 20th of August, 1572, just over a year after the city's founding. He was in his 70s, worn by a decade of hard labor at the edge of the Spanish Empire. But what he left behind was solid. A capital, a trade route, and the skeleton of a colonial system that would operate for more than 3 centuries. By 1580, Spain's grip on the lowland Philippines was real, if never total. The mountains remained unconquered. The south remained Muslim and resistant. But the colonial architecture was in place, and the question of who would inhabit it, who would resist it, and who would transform it entirely was just beginning to. The soldiers had taken the land. Now came the men who would take the souls. Within years of Manila's founding, the great Catholic religious orders arrived in force, each with its own territory, its own methods, and its own vision of what the Philippines should become. The Augustinians had come with Legazpi himself, already planting missions across the Visayas before Manila's walls were finished. The Franciscans arrived in 1578, fanning out across the poor and densely populated regions of central Luzon. The Jesuits landed in 1581, establishing footholds in the Visayas and later pushing into Mindanao. The Dominicans came in 1587, taking responsibility for the Cagayan Valley in the north and, crucially, the Chinese communities growing around Manila. Each order answered to Rome, not to Madrid, a distinction that would cause friction with colonial governors for centuries. But in those early decades, their energy was indispensable. There were never enough Spanish soldiers to hold 300,000 square kilometers of islands by force alone. The friars offered something more efficient than a garrison: belief. What followed was conversion on a scale that had few parallels in the colonial world. Missionaries learned Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, and dozens of other languages, translating prayers, catechisms, and scripture into words that people could actually understand. By 1600, estimates suggest that perhaps 500,000 Filipinos had been baptized. By the mid-17th century, the lowland Philippines was, at least nominally, one of the most thoroughly Christianized regions in Asia. But conversion was never purely spiritual. It came packaged with a policy that reshaped the physical landscape of the archipelago. The Spanish called it reducción, the gathering in. Scattered farming communities living in small clusters across hillsides, riverbanks, and coastal margins were ordered to consolidate into centralized towns built around a central plaza. On one side stood the church. On another, the municipal building. The layout was no accident. These towns, called pueblos, became the operating units of Spanish control. Each was assigned a friar who served simultaneously as priest, census taker, tax collector, judge, and moral authority. He knew who had been baptized, who had paid their tribute, who had married, and who had died. This was colonial administration conducted through the confessional and the baptismal font. To anchor each pueblo spiritually and physically, the orders built. They built on a scale that still astonishes. Massive stone churches rose across Luzon and the Visayas, their walls thick enough to double as fortresses against raids and rebellions. The church at Poway in Ilocos Norte, with its extraordinary buttresses like giant fingers gripping the earth, began construction in 1600 and took nearly a century to complete. San Agustin Church in Intramuros, consecrated in 1607, still stands today as the oldest stone church in the Philippines, having survived earthquakes, wars, and the erasure of almost everything around it. The construction of these buildings was itself an act of transformation. Stone replaced the bamboo and thatch of indigenous ritual spaces. The old practices, the animist ceremonies, the veneration of ancestral spirits called Anito, the authority of the Babaylan, the indigenous spiritual leaders were systematically suppressed. Some survived in hybrid forms, woven quietly into Catholic feast days and folk devotion. But the official culture of the archipelago had been redirected. What the Spanish could not have fully anticipated was how completely Filipinos would make this new faith their own. The Christianity that took root was not simply imported. It absorbed local rhythms of grief and celebration, producing a religious culture of startling intensity that persists to this day. By 1650, the parish system had become the true skeleton of Spanish power, more durable than any fort. The soldiers could be defeated. The friars, embedded in every village, speaking the language, recording the names, were far harder to dislodge. The souls had been claimed. Now came the accounting. With the archipelago mapped, baptized, and reorganized into parishes and pueblos, Spain turned its attention to the fundamental purpose of any empire: extraction. The instrument it reached for was the encomienda, a system already tested in the Americas. transplanted wholesale to Philippine soil. An encomienda was, in theory, a grant of stewardship. The Spanish crown assigned an encomendero, usually a soldier or official, authority over a defined number of Filipino households. In exchange for protection and Christian instruction, those households owed tribute, paid in rice, cloth, gold, or later in coin. A typical tribute in the 1600s amounted to roughly 10 reals per household per year, a sum that seems modest until one considers that most Filipino families operated outside a cash economy entirely. In practice, the system licensed plunder. Encomenderos were stationed far from Manila's oversight, accountable to no one nearby, and motivated entirely by personal profit. Tribute quotas were inflated. Goods were seized beyond what was owed. Violence enforced compliance. Spanish governors received complaints for decades, but the encomenderos were also the men who held the islands together militarily, which made meaningful discipline rare. Woven alongside the tribute system was an obligation far more physically brutal. The Polo y Servicios required every Filipino male between the ages of 16 and 60 to render 40 days of forced labor annually to the colonial government. Roads were built with it. Ships were constructed with it. The galleons that carried silver across the Pacific were assembled in Philippine shipyards by men who had no choice in the matter. The forests of Cavite and Cebu were stripped for timber, and Filipino workers died in numbers that colonial records only partially captured. Then came the bandala. Each year, the colonial government compelled communities to sell fixed quantities of goods, primarily rice, at prices the government itself dictated, prices almost always set far below market value. Families who could not meet their quota were forced to buy goods elsewhere at full price and resell them to the government at a loss. The bandala was legal, systematic, and ruinous. What did this machinery produce in human terms? Population figures tell a partial story. The lowland Filipino population, which may have reached roughly 1.5 million at the time of Spanish arrival, had contracted sharply by the mid-17th century. Tribute records, disease, flight into unconquered highlands, and sheer exhaustion all contributed. Entire communities abandoned their pueblos to escape extraction, preferring the mountains and the uncertain mercy of the unconquered interior. Presiding over all of this was a rigid social architecture. At the apex stood the peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain, who held the highest offices and regarded the colony as a temporary posting for personal enrichment. Below them came the insulares, Spaniards born in the Philippines, who resented their metropolitan counterparts with a bitterness that would one day have political consequences. The mestizos, those of mixed Spanish or Chinese ancestry, occupied a complicated middle ground, sometimes prosperous, always suspect. At the base stood the Indios, the indigenous Filipinos, who fed the system, built the churches, crewed the galleons, and paid for everything. This hierarchy was not merely social custom. It was written into law, encoded in tax rates, marriage regulations, and which doors one could walk through. Yet the empire was never as total as its architects imagined. In the mountains, the unconquered peoples of the Cordillera simply refused. In the south, the sultanates of Mindanao and Sulu held firm against both cross and sword. And even among the baptized lowlanders, resistance found quieter forms that the next century would bring increasingly into the open. While encomenderos squeezed tribute from Filipino villages, something extraordinary was quietly reshaping the world. A single trade route, stretching across the largest ocean on Earth, was connecting civilizations that had never before done business with one another. And Manila sat at its center. It began in 1565 when Andres de Urdaneta cracked a problem that had defeated navigators for decades: how to sail east from Asia back to the Americas. The answer lay in the North Pacific Current, a sweeping arc of wind and water that could carry a ship from the Philippines to Mexico in roughly 4 to 5 months. With that discovery, Spain had its highway. The mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. Each year, 1 or 2 massive galleons departed Manila, loaded to their absolute limits, bound for Acapulco on Mexico's Pacific coast. The return voyage brought back what Asia wanted most desperately: silver. Mountains of it, mined by indigenous and enslaved laborers in the Mexican highlands and the Peruvian Andes, flowed westward across the Pacific in quantities that staggered contemporaries. At its peak, some estimates suggest that roughly half of all the silver produced in Spanish America eventually found its way to Asia through Manila. What traveled east in return was the produce of an entire continent. Chinese silk, woven into bolts of extraordinary quality, filled the galleon's holds. Porcelain, spices, lacquerware, ivory, beeswax, and cotton textiles followed. Spanish colonists in Mexico and Peru, hungry for luxury goods they could not obtain from a Spain that supplied them poorly, were willing to pay extraordinary prices. The Manila Galleon became, for 250 years, one of the most anticipated events in the commercial calendar of the Pacific world. At the beating heart of this system stood a community that colonial authorities simultaneously depended upon and deeply feared. The Sangley, as the Spanish called the Chinese merchants who flooded into Manila after the trade's establishment. By the early 1600s, the Chinese population of Manila numbered perhaps 20 to 30,000, vastly outnumbering the Spanish garrison. They were merchants, craftsmen, laborers, and suppliers. They built the furniture, baked the bread, constructed the buildings, and most critically, they aggregated the Chinese goods that the galleons carried to Acapulco. Without the Sangley, there was no galleon trade. Spanish authorities understood this perfectly. They also understood, or believed, that such a concentration of foreigners represented a permanent threat. The result was a policy of calculated brutality, in which Chinese merchants were confined to a district called the Iberian, just outside Manila's walls, taxed aggressively, and subjected to periodic massacres when fear overcame economic calculation. In 1600s and 1603, Spanish forces and their Filipino allies killed Chinese residents in numbers ranging into the thousands. And yet, within years, the population always recovered because the trade could not function without them. The consequences of all this movement rippled far beyond Manila Bay. The silver that poured into China financed imperial expansion and fueled inflation simultaneously. The silk that reached Mexico created fashion industries and altered what people wore. Scholars today point to the Manila Galleon as one of the earliest engines of genuine globalization, a moment when a single commercial circuit tied together the economies of Europe, the Americas, East Asia, and Southeast Asia into something approaching a unified system. For the Philippines itself, the trade was transformative but uneven. Manila grew wealthy and cosmopolitan. The provinces that fed and crewed and timbered for the galleons grew exhausted. When the trade finally ended in 1815, a victim of war and changing commercial winds, it left behind a city shaped by 3 centuries of being the world's crossroads. What it had not left behind was a Philippines prepared to survive without it. They always came back. That single fact haunted Spanish administrators more than perhaps any other reality of colonial life in Manila. They could burn the Parian, slaughter its inhabitants by the thousands, and scatter the survivors into the countryside. Within a decade, sometimes less, the Chinese were back, rebuilding their stalls, resuming their trades, replenishing a city that could not function without them. It was a relationship built on mutual dependency and mutual contempt, and it would produce some of the most savage episodes in the history of colonial Asia. The Sangley community was, in the most literal sense, the engine of daily life in Manila. They were the bakers and carpenters, the tailors and fishmongers, the blacksmiths and masons. When Spanish authorities once expelled the Chinese population as an experiment, the city nearly starved within months. Every loaf of bread, every piece of furniture, every constructed wall seemed to pass through Chinese hands at some point in its making. The Parian district, established just outside the walls of Intramuros in the 1580s, was designed as a mechanism of control, a ghetto where the Chinese could be watched, taxed, and contained. What it actually became was the commercial heart of the entire colony. Then came 1603. The trigger was a rumor, the most dangerous of colonial currencies. Word reached Manila that a massive Chinese fleet was gathering, sent by the emperor to conquer the islands. The report traced back to a strange episode involving 3 Chinese emissaries who had arrived claiming knowledge of a mountain of gold and cavite. When investigations found nothing, paranoia filled the vacuum. Spanish officials concluded the entire affair had been a scouting mission. With fewer than 2,000 Spanish soldiers to defend the city against a Chinese population perhaps 20 times larger, fear curdled into action. The violence that followed lasted for weeks. Spanish forces, supported by Filipino auxiliaries and Japanese mercenaries, moved through the Parian and surrounding districts with systematic brutality. Estimates of the dead reached 20,000, though some historians place the figure higher. The economic consequences were catastrophic and immediate. Galleon cargoes the following year were sparse. Prices rose throughout the colony. Within a few years, necessity had repopulated the Parian once again. The pattern repeated with grim regularity. In 1639, another massacre followed an uprising in the provinces, where Chinese laborers had been pressed into brutal conditions on sugar estates. Thousands died again. In 1662, the threat of the Chinese commander Koxinga, who had driven the Dutch from Taiwan and issued demands to the Spanish in Manila, triggered yet another wave of killing. Koxinga died before any invasion materialized, but the Chinese community in Manila paid the price for a threat that never arrived. What did the Spanish make of this cycle? Colonial administrators wrote reports that oscillated between acknowledging absolute economic dependence and demanding permanent expulsion. The contradiction was never resolved because it could not be resolved. The Chinese were too useful to lose and too numerous to feel comfortable about keeping. The Sangley massacres reveal something essential about the internal logic of Spanish colonialism in the Philippines. It was a system that generated its own enemies while relying on those enemies to survive. The Chinese community absorbed blow after blow and rebuilt, not out of any affection for the colonial order, but because Manila remained one of the most lucrative trading nodes in the world. They always came back. And the city, for all its fear and violence, always needed them to. As Manila struggled to manage the communities living in its shadow, another transformation was reshaping the islands from within. The cross, not the sword, would prove the most durable instrument of Spanish power. The Spanish crown counted its territories in ledgers, measuring value through tribute rolls and labor quotas. For most Filipinos living under colonial rule, those ledgers translated into something far more immediate: a hand reaching into their harvest, a forced march to the tobacco fields, a friar demanding obedience where a datu once commanded respect. Resistance was perhaps inevitable. What surprised the Spanish was how relentlessly it came. In 1621, a chieftain named Bangka on the island of Leyte renounced his Christianity, rallied followers around the old rituals, and rose against the colonial order. He was nearly 80 years old. The revolt was crushed within months. Bangka executed alongside his son, but the grievances that sparked it never died. 28 years later, in 1649, a man named Sumaroy led a far larger uprising across Samar, spreading into neighboring islands. His central complaint was specific: the forced conscription of Filipinos to build galleons in the shipyards of Cavite, hundreds of miles from their homes, under brutal conditions. Families lost fathers for years at a time. Some never returned. Sumaroy's revolt took the Spanish 2 years and significant military resources to suppress. Bangka, Sumaroy. These were not isolated eruptions. Spanish records from across the colonial period document hundreds of uprisings, ranging from village-level confrontations to multi-island rebellions. The causes echo each other across generations. Tribute demanded beyond what communities could pay. Forced labor pulling men from farms precisely when crops needed tending. Friar abuses, ranging from arrogance to outright cruelty, committed by men who held enormous power over local communities. And beneath it all, the slow erosion of land and traditional authority that had given Filipino society its structure. No revolt illustrated this more powerfully than the rebellion Francisco Dagohoy launched in Bohol in 1744. His immediate grievance was personal. A priest had refused Christian burial to his brother, killed in a duel. But the fury that followed was anything but personal. Dagohoy gathered followers in the island's interior highlands, and for 85 years, the Spanish colonial government could not dislodge him or his successors. 85 years. The Dagohoy rebellion outlasted multiple governors general, multiple Spanish kings, and multiple attempts at military suppression. At its peak, some estimates suggest nearly 20,000 people lived under rebel administration in Bohol's mountains, beyond the reach of both the cross and the crown. Then there was Diego Silang, whose uprising in the Ilocos region in 1762 carried a different character entirely. Silang was educated, politically sophisticated, and seized his opportunity when the British seized Manila during the 7 Years' War, momentarily paralyzing Spanish authority. He declared Vigan free of colonial rule and appealed directly to British forces for recognition. For a brief, remarkable period, he governed. He was assassinated in 1763, betrayed by Filipinos loyal to the Spanish, before his movement could consolidate. His wife, Gabriela Carino, continued the resistance until her capture and execution later that year. Why did these revolts fail? Geography answered first. The archipelago's thousands of islands fragmented resistance, preventing movements from joining across water. Spanish forces, often supported by Filipino auxiliaries from rival regions, could concentrate military power against each uprising in turn. Local leaders commanded fierce loyalty within their communities but rarely beyond them. The very intimacy of Filipino political life, organized around kinship and place, became a structural weakness when confronting an empire with global supply lines. The revolts were suppressed, but they were never forgotten. Each generation of resistance built a vocabulary of grievance and defiance that would take on new meaning in the centuries ahead. The names of Dagohoy and Silang would eventually be spoken not as cautionary tales, but as something else entirely. While Christian Filipinos endured tribute roles and friar authority, another world existed at the southern edge of the archipelago. Here, the Spanish writ simply stopped. Here, the crescent moon flew over fortified river courts where sultans held genuine sovereign power, and where Islam had already taken deep root long before any Spanish ship appeared on the horizon. The Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao were not peripheral chiefdoms. They were sophisticated political entities, with legal traditions rooted in Islamic jurisprudence, trade networks reaching Arabia and China, and warrior aristocracies who understood exactly what Spanish colonization meant and refused it absolutely. When Miguel López de Legazpi's fleet arrived in 1565, these sultanates had already been Islamic for over a century. Their faith was not merely religion. It was identity, law, and resistance fused into one. The Spanish called them Moros, borrowing the same word they had used for Muslim enemies during the Reconquista in Spain. The label carried contempt. What it failed to capture was the extraordinary military effectiveness of those it named. Moro raids on Christian settlements became one of the defining terrors of colonial life in the Visayas and coastal Luzon. Fast outrigger warships called Lanong and Caracoa, sometimes carrying small cannon, descended on fishing villages before dawn. The raids were systematic, targeting people as much as property. Slave-taking was central to the economy of the southern sultanates. Estimates from Spanish records suggest that over the colonial period, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were captured and carried south into bondage. Entire coastal communities were abandoned. Watchtowers called bantayan, many of which still stand today, became as common as church bells in vulnerable regions. The sound of warning drums meant that families had minutes, not hours, to flee inland. Spain responded with forts and punitive expeditions. Zamboanga, on the southwestern tip of Mindanao, became a key Spanish military position, its stone fortifications rising against a landscape the empire could never quite control. Naval campaigns penetrated deep into Moro territory, burning settlements and disrupting trade. And yet the sultanates absorbed these blows and continued. Why? The answer lay in geography and faith working together. Mindanao's river systems and the scattered islands of the Sulu archipelago gave defenders endless options for retreat, regrouping, and counterattack. But more fundamentally, Islam gave Moro resistance a spiritual framework that made submission to a Christian colonial power unthinkable. To surrender was not merely military defeat. It was apostasy. Every sultan, every datu, every warrior understood that the struggle was inseparable from the faith itself. This was not simply politics. It was cosmic obligation. Spanish missionaries, who had proven so effective in transforming lowland Filipino religious life, made virtually no inroads here. The cross found no purchase where the crescent had come first. Conversion attempts failed completely occasionally ending in the deaths of those who attempted them. By the 1880s, Spanish steam-powered gunboats finally gave the colonial military a meaningful technological advantage, allowing deeper and more sustained operations in Moro waters. But even then, full conquest remained a fantasy. When Spanish sovereignty over the Philippines ended in 1898, the Sultanate of Sulu and the peoples of Maguindanao remained undefeated, unconverted, and ungoverned by Madrid. 333 years of colonial rule had simply flowed around them. This unresolved frontier would pass, like everything else, to a new colonial power after 1898. The questions Spain could never answer about Mindanao and Sulu did not disappear. They waited, and they continue to shape the southern Philippines to this day. But before empire changed hands, one final force was gathering in the north, one that would change not just the Philippines, but the very idea of what it meant to be Filipino. The year 1762 changed everything. Not through gradual reform or royal decree, but through cannon fire. Europe's 7 Years' War, a conflict stretching from the forests of North America to the plains of India, had transformed into a genuinely global struggle for imperial supremacy. Britain and Spain found themselves on opposite sides, and British strategists saw an extraordinary opportunity. Manila, Spain's Pacific capital, sat vulnerable on the western edge of a vast ocean. A fleet was assembled in India. In September of 1762, 13 British warships and nearly 7,000 soldiers under Admiral Samuel Cornish and General William Draper appeared off the Philippine coast. Spain's defenses were, by any measure, woefully inadequate. The garrison was undermanned, the fortifications aging, and communication with Madrid took months in each direction. On the 5th of October, British forces breached the walls of Intramuros. The Archbishop of Manila, acting as governor, signed the Articles of Capitulation that same day. The city fell in hours. For the next 20 months, the British flag flew over the oldest Spanish colonial capital in Asia. It was a stunning humiliation for an empire that had held these islands for nearly 2 centuries. But the occupation revealed something even more consequential than Spanish military weakness. Across the archipelago, news of Manila's fall created a power vacuum that Filipinos immediately moved to fill. In the Ilocos region of northern Luzon, a mestizo trader named Diego Silang seized the moment with extraordinary boldness. He rallied the burdened Ilocano population, who had suffered generations of tribute demands and forced labor, and declared the city of Vigan free of Spanish authority in December of 1762. Silang is a striking figure in Philippine history, someone who played every side with remarkable agility, briefly aligning with the British while articulating something that felt, at least partly, like genuine Filipino grievance. He suspended tribute payments. He promised relief from the economic stranglehold of the colonial system. His revolt spread rapidly. For months, Spanish authority in the north effectively collapsed. But the Spanish colonial network, built on alliances with local elites and the church, proved resilient. In May of 1763, Silang was assassinated, betrayed by people within his own circle. His wife, Gabriela Carino, took up the cause with remarkable courage, leading continued resistance until she was captured and publicly executed in September. Their names endure in Filipino memory as among the earliest symbols of resistance to colonial rule. The international stage settled the larger conflict. The Treaty of Paris in February of 1763 ended the 7 Years' War, and under its terms, Britain agreed to return Manila to Spain. The occupation officially ended in 1764. Britain received a ransom payment, though Spain disputed and delayed it for years. Spain received Manila back, but not the same empire. The occupation had exposed every weakness that decades of complacent administration had allowed to accumulate. The military was underfunded, the defenses outdated, and local loyalty was far more conditional than the colonial authorities had assumed. What Diego Salong's revolt demonstrated, in particular, was that Filipino compliance with Spanish rule depended heavily on the perception that Spanish power was permanent and unassailable. Once that illusion cracked, even briefly, the fractures showed everywhere. Madrid responded with a wave of reforms in the following decades, investing in coastal defenses, reorganizing the colonial military, and revisiting economic policies that had long enriched the church and merchant monopolies at the expense of ordinary Filipinos. Yet reforms, however sincere, could not erase what had been seen. The British had come, they had won, and then they had simply left. The colony had nearly shattered during their brief stay. That memory lingered, shaping the slow, complicated awakening of a people who were beginning, however cautiously, to imagine themselves as something more than Spanish subjects. Spain had received a stark warning. The question now was whether Madrid would heed it. The Bourbon monarchs of the late 18th century were reformers by temperament and necessity. Watching Britain's commercial empire expand across the globe, they understood that colonies locked inside mercantilist monopolies were colonies slowly dying. The Philippines, rich in agricultural potential yet largely untapped, needed urgent attention. Governor-General Jose Bosco Y. Vargas arrived in Manila in 1778 with a mandate for transformation. Energetic, pragmatic, and unusually attentive to local conditions, he founded the Economic Society of Friends of the Country in 1781. The society was a remarkable institution, bringing together colonial officials, merchants, and educated Filipinos to study agriculture, promote new crops, and modernize the island economy. Under Basco's encouragement, tobacco cultivation expanded dramatically in the northern provinces, eventually becoming a state monopoly that would generate significant royal revenue. Indigo, silk, and cotton cultivation all received fresh investment and attention. The crown followed with a more ambitious instrument. In 1785, King Charles III chartered the Royal Company of the Philippines, granting it exclusive rights to trade between Spain and the archipelago via the Cape of Good Hope. For the first time, Philippine goods could reach European markets without passing through Mexico City's hands. It was a direct challenge to the old order, and the old order resisted at every turn. Entrenched merchant interests, the church, and Manila's established trading networks all viewed the company with suspicion. Progress was slow, profits inconsistent. The company limped forward for nearly 5 decades before finally dissolving in 1834. Yet its deeper significance lay not in its balance sheets, but in what it represented. An acknowledgement that the Philippines could no longer survive as a mere appendage to the silver trade. That silver trade was itself approaching its end. The Manila-Acapulco Galleon, which had connected Asia to the Americas for 2.5 centuries, made its final voyage in 1815. Mexican independence had already disrupted the trade routes, and the economic logic that had sustained those great ships had long since eroded. The last galleon's arrival closed a chapter that had defined Philippine commerce since 1565, and the silence it left behind was deafening. What filled that silence was, gradually, the wider world. In 1834, Madrid officially opened the port of Manila to international trade. British, American, and other foreign merchants, many already circling the archipelago through informal channels, now entered legally. Sugar, tobacco, hemp, and indigo began flowing outward in volumes that colonial monopolies had never permitted. A cash crop economy took shape, drawing Filipino farmers, Chinese merchants, and foreign trading houses into new and complicated relationships. The Philippines was opening up. The consequences of that opening for prosperity, for inequality, and for national consciousness would define the century to come. In 1782, Governor-General Basco y Vargas made a decision that would reshape Filipino rural life for the next century. The tobacco monopoly introduced that year declared the cultivation, processing, and sale of tobacco an exclusive privilege of the colonial state. No farmer could grow it freely. No merchant could trade it without permission. The plant that had spread quietly through Philippine fields for generations now belonged, in the eyes of the law, to the crown. The human machinery behind this system was concentrated in the fertile valleys of Cagayan and Ilocos in the northern Philippines. Farmers in these regions were compelled to cultivate tobacco on land designated by colonial authorities at prices fixed by the government, with quotas that brooked no shortfall. Inspectors moved through the fields. Penalties for unauthorized planting were severe. Families who had once grown food on their plots now grew tobacco instead, leaving them dependent on purchased rice at prices they could rarely control. The financial returns were staggering. Within decades, the tobacco monopoly was generating roughly half of all colonial government revenue. Ships carrying processed Philippine tobacco reached Spain and Mexico, while the colonial treasury in Manila swelled in ways that earlier governors could only have dreamed of. Madrid noted the figures with satisfaction. The Philippines had transformed, at least on paper, from a financial burden into a productive imperial asset. But the cost was borne entirely by Filipino farmers. Hunger became a recurring feature of monopoly provinces. Families who failed to meet their quotas faced punishment, debt, and dispossession. Smuggling networks flourished, not out of greed, but survival. Communities that had once sustained themselves through diversified agriculture became locked into a single crop, their fortunes entirely subject to colonial pricing and colonial judgment. The resentment that accumulated in those northern valleys did not disappear. It settled quietly into the groundwater of Philippine political memory. For a full century, the monopoly endured, outlasting the governors who designed it, the reformers who occasionally criticized it, and the economic theories that had once justified it. By the 1870s, pressure from Filipino Ilustrados and foreign trading interests was mounting steadily. The monopoly's inefficiencies were costing Spain as much as it earned, and liberal voices in Madrid argued that free markets would generate more wealth than coercion ever could. In 1882, the tobacco monopoly was finally abolished. The northern farmers were free at last to grow or not grow as they chose. But freedom arrived alongside a new economic order already taking shape around them. Export agriculture, driven by sugar in the Visayas and hemp in Bicol, was drawing the whole archipelago into global commodity markets. Large landowners and foreign trading houses stood ready to benefit. Small farmers, freed from one form of control, found themselves entering another. The monopoly was gone. The inequality it had deepened remained, and it would help fuel the storms gathering on the horizon. The year 1834 brought a change that would quietly reorder everything. For the first time in generations, Manila's port was open to ships of all nations. Within decades, that opening expanded further still. Iloilo in the Visayas, Cebu in the Central Islands, and Zamboanga at the tip of Mindanao each gained international port status, drawing the entire archipelago into currents of global commerce that no colonial decree could easily control. The effects were immediate and visible in the landscape itself. In Negros, an island that had once been covered in forest and subsistence farms, the sugar hacienda arrived with startling speed. Planters from Iloilo crossed the strait, claimed land, and set laborers to work clearing fields and building mills. Within a generation, Negros had become one of Asia's most productive sugar regions, its dark soil feeding refineries as far away as Britain and the United States. In Pampanga, north of Manila, sugar estates reshaped the flatlands of central Luzon in much the same way. The physical geography of the Philippines was being rewritten by commodity prices set in London and New York. Abaca fiber, harvested from a plant related to the banana, emerged as another prize. Grown predominantly in Bicol and parts of Mindanao, it became the preferred material for ropes and rigging on sailing ships around the world. No maritime power could easily ignore it. American trading houses moved into the provinces to secure their supply directly, bypassing Manila's older merchant networks entirely. And it was in this new commercial order that a class of Filipinos found their moment. The mestizos, men and women of Chinese Filipino and Spanish Filipino descent, had long occupied an uneasy middle ground in colonial society. Now, with capital accumulated across generations of trade, they moved confidently into land ownership, money lending, and commodity brokerage. They became the indispensable intermediaries between European trading houses and Filipino producers speaking the languages of both worlds. Families who had once been minor figures in provincial towns were building haciendas, educating their children in Manila and abroad, and beginning to think of themselves as something new, something Filipino. British firms such as Kerr and Company and American houses like Russell and Sturgis established themselves in Manila with a permanence that announced the arrival of genuinely global capitalism on Philippine shores. Their warehouses lined the waterfront. Their credit extended into the most distant provinces. Then came 1869 and the opening of the Suez Canal. The journey from Manila to Europe, once measured in months around the Cape of Good Hope, shrank dramatically. Spanish steamships could now reach Barcelona in weeks. Ideas traveled as quickly as cargo. European newspapers, reform pamphlets, and liberal philosophy arrived in Filipino ports fresher than ever before. A new generation was growing up with access to all of it. Educated, prosperous, increasingly impatient with colonial limitations, they were reading, arguing, and beginning to ask harder questions about who the Philippines truly belonged to. While merchants counted their profits along Manila's waterfront and a new Filipino middle class read European newspapers in candlelit rooms, a different kind of power operated in the provinces. It wore a brown robe, or a white one, or a black one, depending on the order. It spoke from the pulpit on Sunday mornings, recorded births and deaths in leather-bound ledgers, and held the titles to hundreds of thousands of hectares of the archipelago's most fertile land. By the 1800s, the Spanish friars had become something the original missionaries of the 16th century perhaps never imagined. They had become the state itself. In Manila and the colonial capital, governors general came and went, sometimes annually replaced by the shifting politics of a distant Madrid. But the Augustinians, Dominicans, Franciscans, and Recollects remained. They knew every family in every parish. They understood local dialect, local grievance, local loyalty. When a new governor arrived in Manila with ambitious reform proposals, the friars needed only to wait. Their institutional memory outlasted every appointed official. The Haciendas told the sharpest part of the story. The Augustinians alone controlled vast estates in Cavite, Laguna, and Bulacan, lands accumulated across centuries through legal grants. Inheritance disputes settled conveniently in church favor and outright absorption of communal territories. Tenant farmers, the Kasama, worked this land in arrangements that bound generation after generation to the same soil. Rents rose. Contracts grew more demanding. Appeals went unheard or were heard by men in the same cloth as those demanding payment. Beyond the land, the friar's authority extended into every meaningful moment of a Filipino's life. He registered your birth and recorded your marriage. He issued the documents required to travel or conduct legal business. He decided what books entered his parish and which ideas were too dangerous to permit. The Inquisition had formally ended elsewhere, but in the Philippine countryside, the friar's judgment on a man's moral character could destroy him just as effectively. Schools remained under ecclesiastical control. What children learned, and crucially what they did not learn, passed through the friar's approval. The University of Santo Tomas, under Dominican supervision, shaped the colony's educated class, producing graduates fluent in theology and cautious in everything else. Surveillance was quiet but constant. Friars reported suspected subversives to colonial authorities, identified men who had read the wrong books or spoken carelessly after Mass. A whisper in the confessional or merely the suspicion of one could precipitate an arrest. The line between spiritual guidance and political policing had ceased to exist. What made this arrangement uniquely corrosive was its visibility. The Filipino Ilustrados, that new educated class emerging from export wealth and Suez Canal connections, could now compare their colonial reality against liberal European standards they had read in fresh printed pamphlets. The contrast was not abstract. They could name the friar who raised their family's rent. They remembered the sermon that condemned a neighbor for owning a particular book. They had watched capable Filipino priests denied parishas that were given instead to Spanish regulars sent from peninsular convents, men who arrived ignorant of the land and its people. The friar was not merely an obstacle. He was the daily, embodied, unkillable face of colonial subordination. That resentment did not dissipate. It gathered. Among the young men now reading in Madrid and Barcelona, among the Ilustrado families weighing what kind of future they wanted, and among the tenant farmers watching another harvest disappear into a friar's account books, the same question was forming. A question about power, dignity, and what it might finally take to reclaim both. That question would soon find a voice. Something had shifted by the 1860s. The ships were faster, the ideas were fresher, and for the first time in 3 centuries, a generation of young Filipinos was arriving in Europe with money in their pockets and questions in their minds. They were called the Ilustrados, the enlightened ones. Sons of the new merchant families grown wealthy on sugar and abaca, they enrolled at the University of Madrid, at Barcelona, at Ghent and Heidelberg. They read Rousseau and Mill. They attended lectures on constitutional law and natural rights. and they looked back across the ocean at the islands their families still called home, and they began to see the colony with devastating clarity. What did liberal Europe offer that the Philippines denied? A free press, representation in government, equality before the law regardless of birth. The Ilustrados did not, at first, demand independence. They demanded something they considered more reasonable. They wanted the Philippines treated as a province of Spain, not a conquered possession. They wanted Filipino voices in the Cortes, the Spanish Parliament. They wanted the friars brought under proper ecclesiastical control. These were reform proposals, measured and legalistic, written in careful Spanish and circulated in pamphlets that traveled slowly back across the world to Manila. But even moderate demands could get a man killed in the wrong climate. And the climate was about to get very cold. The question of who would staff the Philippine parishes had simmered for decades. Filipino secular priests, educated and ordained, argued they deserved to serve their own communities. The Spanish regular orders disagreed with a stubbornness underwritten by 3 centuries of accumulated authority. This secularization controversy was not merely a bureaucratic dispute. It was a contest about whether Filipinos could hold legitimate authority over anything at all. Then came January 1872. A small mutiny broke out at the military arsenal in Cavite, involving Filipino soldiers and workers protesting the loss of certain privileges. It was suppressed within days. Spanish authorities chose to see it as something far larger, a coordinated conspiracy linking the mutineers to the Ilustrado reformers and to Filipino priests who had long agitated for secularization. 3 priests paid with their lives for that interpretation. Father Mariano Gomez, Father Jose Burgos, and Father Jacinto Zamora, remembered together as Gamburza, were arrested, tried on thin evidence, and publicly garroted on the morning of February 17, 1872. Thousands watched at Luneta Field in Manila. The colonial authorities believed they were demonstrating the consequences of sedition. They were demonstrating something else entirely. The execution of Gamburza did not silence dissent. It gave dissent a face. 3 faces, in fact, men who had sought reform through legitimate channels and died for it anyway. The message absorbed by the Ilustrado generation was precise and irreversible. There was no acceptable petition. There was no reform polite enough, no argument careful enough to earn a Filipino full standing under Spanish law. A young boy in Laguna province would later write that it was the martyrdom of Gamburza that first awakened his sense of national consciousness. His name was Jose Rizal, and he was 11 years old in 1872. The age of pamphlets was ending. The age of novels and of something harder and more dangerous was about to begin. The boy from Laguna had grown into something the Spanish authorities had not anticipated. A novelist. Jose Rizal arrived in Europe carrying a grievance sharpened over years of witnessing colonial life up close. He had watched the civil guard harass farmers in his province. He had seen the friars wield power that no bishop could check and no court could challenge. And in Madrid and Berlin and Paris, surrounded by books and liberated from the censor's reach, he began to write it all down. Noli Me Tangere, published in Berlin in 1887, did something that decades of legal petitions had failed to do. It made colonial oppression visible, personal, and emotionally undeniable. Through the story of Crisostomo Ibarra returning home to find his country strangled by friar authority and official corruption, Rizal gave the Philippine condition a human face. The title, meaning "touch me not," borrowed from scripture, but the wound it described was entirely of this world. The novel spread through the islands like fever. Spanish authorities banned it immediately. Possession of a copy could invite arrest, which meant, of course, that everyone wanted one. 4 years later came El Filibusterismo, darker in tone and bleaker in conclusion. Where Noli Me Tangere had still harbored some hope for reform, this second novel killed that hope on the page. Its anti-hero Simon does not petition the government. He plots against it. Rizal was telling his readers something carefully, and they understood. While Rizal wrote fiction, others waged journalism. Graciano Lopez Llena, a gifted speaker and tireless agitator from the Visayas, had already been causing trouble in Spain through pamphlets and public addresses. In January 1889, he and Marcelo H. del Pilar launched La Solidaridad in Barcelona, later moving operations to Madrid. The newspaper became the central organ of what historians would call the propaganda movement, though propaganda then meant simply the propagation of ideas. Del Pilar was its engine. Where Rizal was elegant and literary, Del Pilar was relentless, producing article after article under the pen name Plaridel, dissecting colonial policy, mocking friar hypocrisy, and arguing with cold precision for concrete reforms. The movement's demands were not revolutionary, at least not on paper. Representation for the Philippines in the Spanish Cortes, equal treatment of Filipino and Spanish citizens under the law, expulsion of the regular orders from civil life, freedom of the press. These were the same arguments the Ilustrados had circulated for a generation, now amplified through a proper newspaper reaching readers on 2 continents. Spain's response was consistent refusal. The friars lobbied furiously in Madrid. Colonial governors in Manila tightened surveillance. Reformers who returned home were watched, harassed, and sometimes imprisoned. La Solidaridad limped along on donations that never quite arrived, its contributors riding through poverty and homesickness, and it finally ceased publication in 1895, exhausted. By then, the limits of persuasion had become apparent to those paying close attention. The propaganda movement had succeeded brilliantly at one thing it had not fully intended. It had not reformed the colony. It had created a generation of Filipinos who understood, with precision and bitterness, exactly why reform would never come. Rizal was allowed to return to the Philippines in 1892, only to be arrested within weeks and exiled to Dapitan in Mindanao. The pen had reached its limit. Somewhere in the provinces around Manila, other men were drawing different conclusions and reaching for something less patient than a newspaper. The pen had reached its limit. Someone in Manila had already decided what came next. On July 7, 1892, the same week Rizal was arrested and shipped toward exile in Dapitan. A small group of men gathered in a house in Tondo, one of Manila's oldest and poorest districts. They were not Ilustrados. They had not studied in Madrid or written essays for European newspapers. They were workers, clerks, and tradesmen, men who had grown up watching the colonial order from the bottom of it. And on that humid July evening, they founded the Katipunan. Its full name in Tagalog translated roughly as the Supreme Venerable Association of the Sons of the People. Its initials, KKK, were sewn into flags and scratched into walls across Luzon in the years that followed. Its purpose was unambiguous: not reform, revolution. The man who founded it and the man who embodied it was Andres Bonifacio. He was 29 years old that July, the son of a Tondo barrio captain, orphaned in his teens and forced to support his siblings by selling canes and paper fans in the streets. He was self-educated, voracious, and had read Rizal's novels and the histories of the French Revolution with equal intensity. Where the Ilustrados wore European suits and argued constitutional theory, Bonifacio wore the working clothes of the city poor and spoke directly to the world he knew. History would give him the title the Great Plebeian, and it fit precisely. He was not of the landed class, not of the educated elite. He was of the people the colonial system had never bothered to address, and that is exactly who he went to recruit. The Katipunan grew through secrecy and ceremony. New members were inducted through rituals that drew on indigenous traditions, including the blood compact, an ancient Filipino practice in which members signed their names with their own blood, binding themselves to the organization and to each other. The initiation rites created a sense of brotherhood that cut across village loyalties and regional identities. You were no longer simply from Tondo or Cavite or Bulacan. You were Katipunero. By 1895, membership had spread from Manila's working neighborhoods into the provinces surrounding the capital. Cavite, Bulacan, Pampanga, Batanga. Bonifacio and his lieutenants moved carefully, using a cellular structure of 3-person units where each member knew only their immediate companions. The organization published its own newspaper, Calayan, meaning freedom, which circulated in a single issue before the authorities grew suspicious. That one issue reportedly converted hundreds of new recruits. By the middle of 1896, estimates placed Katipunan membership at somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 Filipinos. The numbers remain disputed, but the scale was extraordinary. Spain's colonial apparatus had been building pressure for 3 centuries. The Katipunan had become the vessel into which all of it had poured. Then, in August of 1896, a member's confession to a priest ended the secrecy. The friar reported what he had heard. Spanish authorities began making arrests. Bonifacio, understanding the window was closing, gathered his followers at Pugadlawan, a barrio north of Manila, and on August 23rd, they made their declaration. Members tore up their cedulas, their Spanish identity documents, and shouted for independence. The cry echoed across Luzon. The Philippine Revolution had begun. 300 years of colonial rule had produced this moment, and the man standing at its center had never left his own country to study it. The question now was whether revolution could succeed where reform had failed, and whether the Katipunan could hold together long enough to find out. The cedulas lay in pieces on the ground at Pugadlawan. Now came the harder work of war. The early battles were desperate and costly. In the days following August 23, 1896, Bonifacio led attacks on Spanish targets around Manila, including an assault on the San Juan powder depot that was repulsed with significant casualties. The Katipuneros were brave and numerous, but they were armed largely with bolos, bamboo spears, and whatever firearms they had managed to gather in secret. Spanish colonial forces, reinforced from the peninsula and equipped with modern rifles, pushed back hard. Around Manila, the revolution stalled. But south of the capital, in Cavite province, something different was happening. There, local commanders with stronger organizational networks and greater access to captured Spanish weapons were winning. Towns fell. Spanish garrisons retreated. And from the towns of Imus and Cowit, a young mayor and militia commander named Emilio Aguinaldo was accumulating victories that Bonifacio, bleeding in the hills north of Manila, could not match. While the revolution found its footing in the field, Spain answered with executions. On December 30th, 1896, José Rizal was marched across the Luneta in Manila and shot by firing squad. He was 35 years old. The Spanish authorities had condemned him as the spiritual godfather of the uprising, though Rizal himself had openly opposed armed rebellion. They believed his execution would break the revolution's spirit. They were catastrophically wrong. Rizal's death did not extinguish the fire. It became the fire. His name passed through every province, across every class that had wavered about joining the uprising. The Ilustrado families who had hesitated now had a martyr to mourn. The peasant fighters already in the field now had a name to shout. The execution transformed a political movement into something closer to a sacred cause. By early 1897, the revolution had survived its infancy. But surviving and winning were different things, and within the Katipunan's leadership, tensions that had simmered for months were approaching a breaking point. The fault line ran between Bonifacio and Aguinaldo. It was partly personal, partly regional, partly the oldest tension in any revolutionary movement, the question of who should lead. Bonifacio had founded the Katipunan and ignited the revolution. Aguinaldo had won the battles that gave it credibility. Their supporters had grown into rival factions. In March of 1897, delegates gathered at a church in Tadros in Cavite to resolve the question. The Tadros Convention was meant to unify the revolution under a single government. Instead, it tore it apart. When the votes were counted, Aguinaldo had been elected president. Bonifacio received a lesser post, and when a delegate publicly questioned his qualifications for even that role, Bonifacio declared the entire election invalid and walked out. The break was irreparable. Bonifacio attempted to consolidate his own authority in the north, and his enemies within the movement accused him of sedition against the new revolutionary government. Aguinaldo, consolidating power with the backing of Cavite's landed class, had Bonifacio arrested. The trial was brief and the outcome predetermined. In May of 1897, Andres Bonifacio, the man who had founded the Katipunan in a Tondo house 5 years earlier and torn his cedula at Pugad Lawan to begin the revolution, was executed on the slopes of Mount Buntis. He was 33 years old. His death haunts Philippine history. The great plebeian had given the revolution its soul, and the revolution had consumed him. The Ilustrado class and the landed Principalia, the very groups the Katipunan had organized against, had reasserted their place at the top of the insurgency's leadership. The revolution now belonged to Aguinaldo and the gentry of Cavite. Whether it could still deliver what Bonifacio had promised to the poor and the powerless of Manila's streets remained an open and painful question. Spain, meanwhile, believed it could still extinguish the uprising before that question was ever answered. The negotiations that followed would surprise everyone involved. By the middle of 1897, neither side could claim a decisive advantage. Spanish forces controlled the cities and the coasts, but Aguinaldo's fighters held the mountains and the countryside of Luzon. Every Spanish column that pushed into the hills bled men to ambushes and disease. Every Filipino assault on fortified positions ended in retreat. The war had settled into an exhausting stalemate that neither army could break. It was this deadlock that opened the door to negotiation. Through the autumn of 1897, intermediaries shuttled between the colonial government and the revolutionary leadership, now headquartered in the mountains near the Bayak-Nabato caves in Bulacan. The Spanish governor, Fernando Primo de Rivera, understood that military victory might cost more than Spain was willing to pay. Aguinaldo, meanwhile, was managing a movement still fractured by Bonifacio's execution and running short of ammunition and supplies. On December 14, 1897, they signed the Pact of Bayak-Nabato. Under its terms, Aguinaldo and the senior revolutionary leaders would surrender their arms and accept exile. In exchange, Spain would pay roughly 800,000 pesos in several installments and promise reforms, though those promises carried no enforcement mechanism and no timeline. Within weeks, Aguinaldo and approximately 30 of his officers boarded a ship for Hong Kong. They arrived carrying the first installment of the Spanish money, perhaps 400,000 pesos, and the belief, or at least the hope, that the agreement would hold. It did not hold. Back in the Philippines, guerrilla bands that had never accepted the pact continued fighting. The colonial government resumed repression. The promised reforms never materialized. In Hong Kong, the exiled leaders watched from their hotel rooms as the truce dissolved into the same cycle of violence they had left behind. And then came an entirely new development, one that no one in Manila or Bayak-Nabato had anticipated. In the early months of 1898, the United States and Spain moved steadily toward war over Cuba. American naval commanders in the Pacific began thinking about Spanish positions in Asia. Commodore George Dewey, commanding the Asiatic Squadron in Hong Kong Harbor, started making inquiries. His officers made contact with the Filipino exiles living nearby. The conversations were informal at first, exploratory, but the message was clear enough. A war was coming, and the Americans wanted to know whether Aguinaldo's fighters might be useful. Aguinaldo listened carefully. He had Spanish money in his pocket, a shattered truce behind him, and now a new imperial power offering vague but suggestive partnership. What exactly the Americans were promising, and what they actually intended, would prove to be one of the most consequential misunderstandings in Philippine history. The pact had bought Spain only a few months of quiet. A far larger storm was already forming on the horizon, and it was sailing west across the Pacific. On the morning of February 15, 1898, the American battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 sailors. The cause was almost certainly an accident, a spontaneous ignition in a coal bunker. But in the American press, the story was different. Newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst screamed of Spanish treachery. Remember the Maine became a rallying cry that swept across the United States like a brush fire. Within weeks, a nation that had been watching Cuba from a cautious distance was demanding blood. Spain and the United States declared war in late April of 1898. The fighting would span 2 oceans, but it was in the Pacific where it began with breathtaking speed. Commodore George Dewey had been waiting. On the night of April 30th, he led his 6 warships south from the Chinese coast and into the mouth of Manila Bay under a moonless sky. The Spanish colonial government knew he was coming. Admiral Patricio Montojo positioned his fleet near Cavite, though what he commanded was less an armada than a collection of aging, underpowered vessels, many barely seaworthy, their guns outranged by the American squadron now bearing down on them. At 5:41 on the morning of May 1st, 1898, Dewey turned to his captain and gave the order that would end 3 centuries of Spanish naval power in Asia. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The battle lasted roughly 7 hours. It was not a contest. By early afternoon, every Spanish vessel lay burning, sunk, or run aground in the shallows. Nearly 400 Spanish sailors were dead or wounded. Dewey lost not a single man. The sound of those guns carried across the bay and into the streets of Manila, and everyone who heard them understood that the world had just changed. But Dewey had a harbor, not a city. He needed troops on the ground, and for that, he needed Emilio Aguinaldo. The Commodore sent a ship to Hong Kong. Aguinaldo arrived in Cavite on May 19th aboard an American vessel carrying American assurances that felt, to him, like promises of independence. What exactly was said between the 2 men remains disputed to this day. Aguinaldo believed the Americans had pledged to support Philippine self-rule. American officials would later insist no such commitment was ever made. In the gap between those 2 positions, a tragedy was already taking shape. Whatever the truth of those conversations, Aguinaldo acted like a man who had received a guarantee. He reorganized his forces immediately and called on Filipinos across the archipelago to take up arms. They answered in extraordinary numbers. Through May and June, Filipino revolutionary soldiers swept through province after province. Spanish garrisons, already demoralized and cut off from reinforcement, surrendered or retreated toward Manila. The revolution that the Pact of Biak-na-Bato had seemed to extinguish burned hotter than ever. By mid-June, Filipino forces controlled nearly every corner of Luzon outside the capital walls. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo stood on the balcony of his family home in Kawit, Cavite as a band played a new national anthem for the first time. He unfurled a flag sewn in Hong Kong during the months of exile. Before a crowd of soldiers and townspeople, he read the Philippine Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the birth of a sovereign nation. The cheers that day were real, the emotion genuine, the moment historic. But the Americans watching from the harbor had not been invited to the ceremony, and they had not recognized the declaration. Somewhere in that silence lay the shadow of everything that was coming next. On August 13, 1898, American and Spanish commanders staged a performance. By prior secret arrangement, Spanish Governor General Fermin Jodenes surrendered Manila to American forces, having negotiated the terms in advance through Belgian Consul Edward Andre. Filipino soldiers, who had bled and fought to surround that city, were physically barred from entering. Aguinaldo's forces stood at the gates of their own capital while the 2 colonial powers conducted a choreographed changing of the guard. The humiliation was deliberate, and it was total. 4 months later, on December 10, 1898, Diplomats gathered in Paris and signed their names to a treaty that transferred the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico from Spain to the United States. The price for the archipelago was $20 million. No Filipino representative sat at that table. No Filipino voice was consulted. 333 years of Spanish rule ended not with liberation, but with a sale. The outrage that followed was immediate and inevitable. On February 4, 1899, a Filipino soldier named Willie Grayson shot and killed 2 Philippine Republic soldiers who had crossed into American-controlled territory in Manila. Within hours, the Philippine-American War had begun. It would last officially until 1902, though resistance continued for years beyond that. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos died before American authority was firmly established. The revolution that had seemed so close to victory in Cowit found itself fighting a new colonial master with deeper pockets and no intention of leaving. Spain was gone, but Spain's 3.5 centuries had not vanished with it. Walk into almost any Philippine town today, and the Spanish colonial era announces itself in stone and steeple. The Catholic Church, introduced by Legazpi's missionaries in the 1500s, now counts more than 80% of Filipinos among its faithful, making the Philippines the largest Catholic nation in Asia and the 3rd largest in the world. The Baroque churches the Augustinians and Franciscans built in the 16th and 17th centuries still anchor town plazas from Ilocos Norte to Zamboanga. 4 of them are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The Spanish language itself faded after American administrators replaced it with English in schools, but its fingerprints remain everywhere. Filipino and its sister languages absorbed thousands of Spanish words into their everyday vocabulary. Surnames given during the Claveria Decree of 1849, when Governor Narciso Claveria forced Filipinos to adopt Spanish family names for census purposes, still identify millions of Filipinos today. The food, the fiestas, the legal traditions, the grid of plaza and church at every town's heart, these are the architecture of 333 years pressed into the daily rhythms of modern life. Spain arrived in the Philippines carrying a cross and a sword, seeking souls and silver. What it left behind was something more complicated and more permanent, a civilization reshaped, a people transformed, and an identity that remains, even now, impossible to fully separate from the colonial story that made it. 333 years of Spanish rule did not end in 1898. They live on in every church bell, every family name, and every faith-filled fiesta across the Philippine archipelago. Subscribe for more histories that refuse to be forgotten.